stop slipping and stop cutting your socks. We have 15 different color options between 3 grip socks and 2 sleeve types. Something for everybody at a price that just makes sense. Available now at puregripsocks.com.
The whole point of a takedown model is value for money, where as an alternative to the top end option that is typically very expensive, you pay a lot less for a takedown model but still get a great quality product. But at what point does the price get so high that it's no longer a matter of value for money and more so just a case of you getting what you've paid for? Let me explain. Ladies and gentlemen, say hello to the brand new Nike Phantom 6 Pros, the first takedown models below the Elites, which are some of the most expensive boots currently on the market, the lows retailing for $270, the highs for $295. However, the Pros are quite a bit less expensive, with the low cut variation retailing for $170 and the mid cut variation retailing for $180. Where yes, when compared to the Elites, the lows are $100 less and the highs are $115 less. That is not insignificant savings, but we cannot disregard the fact that both of these football boots are pushing nearly $200. In other words, even though these are technically takedown models, they are priced as high as some top-end football boots. Where if value for money is even remotely a concern for you, which I assume it is if you're shopping for a takedown model, you would be crazy not to consider all the different top-end football boots in either older colorways or older generations that used to retail for $250+ but you can now get on sale for in and around the same price as a retail Phantom 6 Pro. And while it's not the perfect example, because obviously the Mizuno Alpha 2 Elite is a very different style of football boot, this at full retail, no discount whatsoever, is the exact same price as these Phantom 6 Pro highs. This is a takedown model, and this is legitimately one of the best top-end speed boots on the market. In other words, even though these are way cheaper than the Elites, the price for a takedown model has still gone up, which also means that the standard and expectation should also be a lot higher. So with that in mind, is there any chance that the Phantom 6 Pro high or low is worth its retail price? We're going to discuss exactly that in today's video as we go over all the details of the Phantom 6 Pro, talk about how they compare to the more expensive Elite variation, of course how they fit and feel on feet, and ultimately conclude whether or not this is good value for money or just a good pair of football boots that happen to be less expensive than most top-end models. Because there's definitely a difference. So if you're interested in learning more, please stick around, and if you are interested in a pair for yourself, you can pick these up below their normal retail prices by way of some exclusive SR4U coupon codes via the links down below. And really quickly, if you enjoy the content, perhaps want to see more takedown models reviewed on the channel, don't forget to drop a like on this one. And if you're not subscribed already and appreciate the unsugar-coated, brutally honest, unsponsored content on this channel, make sure you hit that subscribe button along with the little bell notification so you don't miss out on my reviews of all the latest football boots of 2025. So first things first, let's get this out of the way. Low versus high, which one should you go for? Well, exactly like the Elites, it really just depends on personal preference. The heel construction is the same no matter which one you go for, where there is an internal structure, but for the most part the back is left really soft. The only difference is that on the high cut variation, you of course get that fly knit collar, basically just some extra elasticated material wrapping around the lower part of your ankle. As far as mid-cut, or in this case high-cut football boots from Nike go, this is actually a relatively low collar. So if you like the collar, go for the highs. If you don't, go for the lows. I do find it interesting that you pay less of a premium for the highs at the Pro tier than you do at the Elites. It's $25 extra there, but only $10 extra here. Make that make sense, Nike. But regardless, both feel great. And again, there's no difference in fit or comfort. With the other significant or insignificant difference, depending on your opinion, being what's happening across the top of the foot. But before we talk about that, we must discuss what's happening with the upper of the Phantom 6 Pro, and that is the Venom Skin material, where you'll notice that this does feature what is aesthetically a very similar look to that top end Elite. However, instead of grip knit, this is a thin mesh with a foam underlay and a fuse layer on top to create what Nike is now calling Venom Skin, with a grippy texture on the surface that I would argue is every bit as grippy on the ball as what you'll find from grip knit. Something that I would argue is a very good thing, because historically on all Phantom Takedown models, whether it was the Pro or the Academy, you got that extra grip on the top end model when they have featured grip knit uppers, but you never really got anything on the Takedown models. Nike have changed that this time around with both the Pros as well as the Academies, where in the case of the Pros, I'd actually make the argument that the Venom Skin upper feels slightly more grippy than that of the grip knit one on the Elites. Having said that, the difference is ultimately very minimal, where I could definitely see people who have tried both of these boots saying that the Elites feel slightly more grippy than the Pros and vice versa. My logic, and I think why the Pros feel that slightly more sticky on the ball, is that this Venom Skin top layer, effectively a grippy Nike skin, if you wanted to compare it to past Nike products, is effectively that, a top layer that is completely covering the surface of the upper, whereas the grip knit material on the Elite model is sticky because of the yarns themselves, which means that there's just going to be more texture to the surface rather than what is still a ridge texture, but ultimately a flatter overall surface, which allows for more contact in the ball and therefore a little bit of additional grip. Nonetheless, if you like that extra grip sensation for the sake of control, something that personally I'm a really big fan of, this does just as good a job of that, if not slightly better, than what the Elites have on offer. We're circling back to where I started. Just like the Elites, the highs are going to give you this lace cover that is partially made from Flyknit, but you can see a section across the middle is that ridge texture with the Venom Skin material that gives you additional grip and of course covers up the lacing system underneath, whereas the low cut variation has that hooded design originally introduced on the Phantom GX1 with the laces completely exposed, meaning that you don't get that additional grip further up the middle of the foot. Both are great, of course, and I don't really think there's a bad choice between them, but if you're curious about my opinion, both because of the way that they look and because I just like the idea of the laces being covered and having that extra grip, the highs would be my preference out of the two, where I just think if you're gonna have extra grip on the ball, why not have as much as possible? However, Nike doesn't necessarily think that, because just like we saw on the Academies, there's this little section here that's highlighted in a different color. You can see that the ridges are actually glossed over in like a light gray. That is not grippy whatsoever. It's just a smooth, slick finish directly in an area of the foot that you're going to be using to strike the ball. Why they've done this on the cheaper variations and of course not on the top end Elite, I have absolutely no clue why. It makes no sense to me whatsoever, but it is definitely something to be aware of. Not that you can really feel it in all honesty, but it just seems like a weird thing to do given the all-over grip concept of the Phantom 6. Aside from the grip on the surface, the upper itself, like I mentioned, is more or less a really thin mesh. The ridge texturing on the surface is added on after the fact. It's not part of the mesh construction, and then that mesh is backed by a really thin layer of foam pretty much all the way through the forefoot and toe box area, and then of course the boots are lined in a really thin nylon material, as you'll see from most pro tier Nike takedowns, where exactly as you'd expect, it's thin, it's soft, it's pliable, it feels really good on feet. However, I would make the argument that for $170, or in the case of the highs, $180, it's not necessarily the most impressive material. In that, again, for what is effectively a top-end football boot price tag, there are two football boots that come to mind as being direct comparisons to this mesh-based upper. The first being the Lotto Solista 100 Gravity and the Charlie Zenetic, both football boots that I don't think very many people interested in the Phantom 6 Pro have any interest in whatsoever. However, because this bears a Nike swoosh. Now they've got your attention. Where don't get me wrong, I'm not saying that this upper feels bad, but certainly when you compare it to the grip knit upper of the Phantom 6 Elite or something more engineered like the grip knit upper found on the Mercurial Vapor and Superfly, this just has a simplicity to it that maybe is a little bit lacking in structure and a little bit lacking in terms of overall engineering. It feels very comfortable on feet, don't get me wrong, but if you're looking for security and lockdown and some added stability, it's just not part of this upper construction. This is a simple mesh designed to feel soft on feet and not much else. Whether or not you should expect more than that for nearly $200, I suppose is up to you to decide. We talked about it a little bit already, but across the top of the foot, you are going to find a lacing system on both of these football boots. It's just covered up with the high cut variation where the laces themselves are anchored by way of nylon loops rather than actual lace holes. Again, exactly the same as what you'll find on that top end Elite model. However, across the top of the foot, no matter what, you're going to find that elasticated Flyknit material, meaning that with the laces tied tight, for the most part, the boots feel pretty much the same across the top of the foot. Moving to the rear internally, because we haven't talked about that yet, and I'll do the lows just so you can see it a little bit better. You have this really soft microfiber liner, again, not dissimilar to that of the Elite. Decent padding, and again, because they don't have a ton of structure back here, it's just a very easy to get along with heel shape that will pretty much adjust to your feet specifically, and for the vast majority should feel pretty comfortable. Then the insole, fully removable, I'll give you guys a quick look at that. It's pretty standard as far as just being a mesh liner on the surface, and it's made from a single layer of this kind of multicolor confetti Ortholite style foam, relatively thin, still pretty spongy, and again, nicer than what you're gonna find on most Takedown models, but as far as overall feel is concerned, genuinely nothing special. Moving to the base, you're going to find a sole plate and stud pattern that should look pretty familiar to you, and that's because it is more or less the same as the Elite. However, it does utilize different plastics for the sole plate, which as a result make the Pros feel still flexible, but maybe a little bit softer in terms of the bend through the forefoot than what you'll find on the Elites. We're talking about a very minor difference in terms of what you can actually feel, but there is a difference nonetheless. And then as far as the FG stud pattern is concerned, this of course does include that new setup, which gives you the 5 Cyclone 360 bladed studs in the forefoot toe box area, your 4 conical studs kind of at the base of the forefoot, and then a combination of the blades and the rounded studs underneath your heel. The design, at least according to Nike, as they have always pushed with Cyclone 360, is the prioritization of rotational movement. However, as we know, blades, especially this thin and aggressive, just dig into the ground and provide tons and tons of bite. It's kind of like a hybrid of the Mercurial Anti-Empo stud pattern, I guess if you wanted to compare it to something else on the market, but for the most part, this does end up coming across as feeling more like a pair of speed boots than a traditional stud layout. Where on firm natural grass, you get plenty of bite when pushing off. You get that little bit of freedom to twist and pivot because of the conical studs at the base of the forefoot. But if you're on your toes, for the most part, there's just tons and tons of grip. Not an ideal layout for use on artificial grass. If that's something that you need, I would strongly recommend going for the AG Pro variation. But for use on natural grass, as long as you like an aggressive stud pattern, this one definitely does a decent job. And then there's the weight, where I think most people would want to know how the Pros stack up against the top end Elites, all in the same size, 9.5 US. We'll start off with the high cut variations because they are technically the heavier models because of the extra material. The Elite weighs in at 7.4 ounces in a size 9.5 US, the equivalent of 210 grams. Change that scale back to ounces, and we'll throw on the Pro variation, which you can see weighs in at 6.55 ounces, the equivalent of 186 grams. And then in the case of the lows, the Elites weigh in at 6.7 ounces, the equivalent of 190 grams. We'll change the scale back to ounces one more time, and we'll throw on the low cut Pro variation, and you can see that they weigh in at 6.2 ounces, the equivalent of 176 grams. A result that I'm not sure anybody was expecting, in that not only are the Pros lighter than the Elites, they're effectively the two lightest football boots currently on the market, with the highs basically tying for first with the F50 Plus version 2 at $300 and the low cut version being the lightest football boot on the market, period, end. How have they done this, you ask? Well, it's pretty simple. You take a top-end sole plate construction, don't build it out of unnecessarily heavy plastic, and then you make an upper from thin mesh and foam, and you have a recipe for what is quite clearly a very lightweight final product. In other words, the Phantom 6 Pro high and low is not only lighter than the Elite alternatives, they are lighter than even the top-end Mercurials, which is kind of crazy. When it comes to the fit and feel on feet, because the upper construction is more or less exactly the same as the Elites, you'd expect these to feel pretty good. And because the upper is basically just a thin layer of mesh and a thin layer of foam, it's super pliable and very sock-like immediately when you put them on. This is not a pair of football boots that require a ton of break-in time. They're going to be very comfortable straight out of the box. The one thing that I will say, and this is going to be one of the biggest differentiators between the Elites and the Pros, is that this upper, in comparison to the Elite's grip knit, definitely has a lot less structure to it, where if you're looking for that very secure, responsive, dare I say kind of techie feel on feet, this just feels very simple and somewhat unimpressive in that aspect. Whereas we know with football boot uppers, it's kind of a bit of give and take, where if you want a bunch of softness, you typically give up structure. And when you give up structure, you give up responsiveness and lockdown and general security. Where I don't necessarily want to say that these feel unstable on feet, but certainly in comparison to the Elites, they feel a little bit more loose in terms of when you're moving around in them. And in the long term, which is very difficult for anybody to comment on, given that these have only been out for a couple of weeks, I would definitely bet on the Elites holding up a little bit better than the Pros, simply based on this upper just being really thin mesh at the end of the day. Where it feels really good now, but we'll see how it ultimately holds up in the long term. As far as fit and sizing is concerned, the shaping is more or less identical to that of the Elites, which is an all-new shape for the Phantom 6 generation, where effectively they have increased the width and roundness as well as the volume through the forefoot and toe box area, which I think makes for a much more comfortable fit compared to the previous generation Phantoms, which had a little bit more of that kind of pointed shape to the toe box. This makes it by far the most accommodating football boot from Nike as far as their three lines are concerned for wider foot types. However, that is not to say that either of these boots are exceptionally wide. If that's something that you really need, I would strongly urge you to go for something with a leather upper that's going to have that ability to stretch. But if you've worn any Nike boots over the last several years and had a good experience in terms of fit and didn't have an issue with the width, these should fit you just fine. And like I said, will work well for most people. And as far as sizing is concerned, I'm wearing these in my usual size 9.5 US, and the fit and the length is perfect. So if you are looking to get a pair for yourself, just like the top end Elites, I would strongly recommend going true to size in order to achieve the best possible fit. And then, like we already talked about, if you are wondering what's the difference between the lows and the highs when it comes to fit and comfort, the answer to that question is pretty much nothing. So in conclusion, while I don't necessarily love the fact that Nike have effectively created the most expensive takedown models of all time, for what you pay, it is undeniably a very unique combination of features that I could see a lot of people really liking. Where in comparison to the much more expensive Elite model, the grip is there, the touch is there, the comfort and fit is on point, the traction and sole plate is more or less exactly the same, and you're getting all of those very similar features in a package that is not only lighter than the Elites, but effectively as light as you can get in the industry right now. Where certainly if your boots being as light as possible is an important factor for you, the $170 Phantom 6 6 Pro would be the best value for money speed boot on the market, I guess. Both in that it's the lightest boot on the market and also the least expensive of all the light boots, which I suppose makes it fantastic value for money. If we're just talking control boots though, if I'm given the choice between the Pros and the Elites, even though the Pros are crazy light in comparison, I still think the Elites feel more premium on feet. That grip knit upper just has more structure and lockdown and responsiveness, and you can feel the technical aspect of how it was put together, where in comparison, the Pros just feel a lot more simple, which isn't necessarily a bad thing. I just don't think that it gives off the same premium vibe as the true top-end Elite model. But if you don't care as much about structure and you just want something that feels comfortable on your feet and gives you effectively all the benefits of that top-end Phantom 6 Elite in an even lighter weight overall package, I definitely think that the $170 and $180 price tags are pretty justified. Where I'll leave you with this: is the Phantom 6 Pro good value for money? Undeniably, yes. These are great football boots for what they cost. However, because they cost so much, you now have so many different options to choose from, not just in lower priced top-end models, but even higher priced ones in older colorways that have been deeply discounted because they release new colorways every other day. Moral of the story being, these are great for what they cost, but if you truly want to get the best value for your money, you need to consider what other options you have, because while less expensive than a top-end model, they're still not cheap.